Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Niall Stanage. My usual debating partner, Robbie Suave, is off carousing elsewhere. So I have Stephen Kent with me here, and I'm delighted to see you, Stephen.
I hear a random federal judge just blocked Robbie from being here.
Exactly.
Just tweeted it out, injunction, Robbie's gone.
They're just moving on everything these days. So we have a lot to get to, including not an injunction against Robbie Suave, but other kinds of injunctions. Because it seems like every other day, there's a news headline about a federal judge blocking a Trump administration move. A federal judge this week blocked Trump's executive order banning transgender people from military service.
And another judge this week blocked DOJ's efforts to dismantle USAID, arguing the move was likely unconstitutional. And a separate judge earlier in March blocked the Trump administration from freezing billions in federal funds.
There's one particular case that raises the gravest questions about whether Trump will comply with court orders.
The case is about Trump invoking the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members without a hearing.
Let's take a look at a brief timeline here, which is derived from a New York Times analysis. On Friday, March 14th, President Trump signed the Alien Enemies Act. That's not actually correct. He signed an executive order invoking the Alien Enemies Act, but we'll press on. The White House did not announce that executive order until the next day. Then at 5:26 and 5:44 p.m. on Saturday, two deportation flights departed for El Salvador. At 6:48 p.m., Judge Boasberg verbally ordered the planes to turn around. And by the time Boasberg gave his order, one plane was apparently already flying over Mexico, while the other was over the Gulf of Mexico or America, if you prefer. The planes did not turn around. Then at 7:26, the judge's written order was posted online, but it did not have the instructions to turn the planes around. A third deportation flight left at around 7:36 p.m.
And of course, many raised questions as to whether the White House violated Trump's order. The Trump administration says they did not violate the order. They argue that they did not deport the 5 Venezuelan illegal immigrants in custody who sued the Trump administration. The DOJ also says that judge's written order did not have the instructions to turn the plane around. Here is President Trump on Fox News this weekend on whether he'd ever violate a court order.
Are there circumstances where you would defy a court order?
Well, I think that, number one, nobody's been through more courts than I have.
Going forward,
I had judges
would you
that were
defy
so
a court
corrupt.
order? Because that we all know
No,
that, and that was
I
outrageous.
never did defy a court order.
And you wouldn't in the future?
No, you can't do that. However, we have bad judges. We have very bad judges, and these are judges that shouldn't be allowed. I think at a certain point you have to start looking at what do you do when you have a rogue judge.
Trump called the judge in this particular case a radical left lunatic and said that he should be impeached for impeding what voters want. This blast prompted Chief Justice John Roberts to issue a statement which read, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose."
Here's Fox's Mark Levin on the situation.
I would say that John Roberts, who I knew before he was a judge, when we both worked in the Reagan administration, it's time to grow up here. This is an issue of separation of powers, and if it's not resolved, you basically, in the form of your question, have answered it. How the hell are we going to have 680 individual, unelected federal judges, they're federal district judges, not federal national judges, all sitting there behind their desks with their 2 or 3 clerks saying, you know, I don't like this idea of Trump sending this. I don't like this idea of banning transgender. I don't like this idea. This is exactly what Locke and Montesquieu and Jefferson and Madison warned.
And the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh also chimed in.
There needs to be an all-out war at this point against activist judges. And what does that war look like? Well, it begins with this, by just ignoring them. Drawing the line in the sand and saying, okay, the judges have certain powers, certain responsibilities, a certain jurisdiction, but their powers and jurisdiction do not encompass everything.
The New York Times also recently reported that there are federal judges overseeing Trump cases who feel unsafe and have been receiving threats. While the Times noted that threats against judges aren't anything new, some federal judges are warning that the dangers in that respect appear to be rising. A lot to talk about here, Stephen. I will lead off because I think it's very dangerous what the Trump administration and its assorted allies are doing here, which is suggesting that a president has the capacity to ignore the courts. We saw that from Matt Walz and to a degree from Mark Levin. And we see it also from other people in the administration. Tom Homan, the border czar, talking about he doesn't care what the judges say, we're not stopping. Elon Musk has characterized judicial decisions that go against the president as tyranny. This, I think, is both dangerous in itself and misunderstands the nature of a pluralist democracy. And I've said this before. Last November, we did not elect an emperor or a king. We elected a president who remains subject to the judicial branch and to judicial review and to the rule of law. And Donald Trump seems to me not to accept that.
Well, I certainly think that is true. I think two things can be going on at once. I think you can say we do need to have sort of an all-out push, particularly from the conservative movement, to rebalance the role that certain judges play in the judicial branch in actually stopping executive orders, putting those through the appellate review process, taking those things to the Supreme Court, and relitigating the role of the judicial in checking the executive. But I think on the flip side, one of the things that I found to be most arson-like during the ascendancy of the left during the first Trump administration was this sort of rush to go, oh, we need to get rid of the U.S. Senate. This is a problematic institution. We need to diminish the power of the Supreme Court. We need to expand the amount of judges and then pack it. This kind of thinking basically tries to leverage as much power from you as you can out of these institutions, and then when you don't like what they're doing, you try to strip them of their power. I don't like making the Supreme Court the bad guy just because they ruled against you on something, and I don't like it when we over-dramatize the villainy of certain district judges. Challenge them, take it to court, and see if you can win.
So I agree on the court packing question. I have never been an advocate or a fan of court packing, and I think it is not only a dangerous road, but a road that leads to absurdity, because presumably what would happen would be that every time either party had the White House and a congressional majority, they would increase the number of judges on the Supreme Court bench. And, perhaps after our time, you'd end up with some 47-member Supreme Court that had been packed on 12 different occasions. So I think that is absurd. But I also find it absurd whenever we see the comments there from people like Levin and Walsh, the idea that, these activist judges. In November last year, the Republican Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, released a press release celebrating the filing of his 100th lawsuit against the Biden administration. There were apparently 133 multi-state lawsuits against the Biden administration. Now, I have no objection to the lawsuits being filed. But had President Biden just said, we'll ignore that. Yeah. We won't stop whatever the judges say.
Conservatives
people would have been rightly
always point
outraged.
to when the Biden administration didn't like the ruling around the repayment or forgiving of student loans. I mean, the Biden administration was emphatic that they were going to try and just blow past the Supreme Court on this.
I don't think, sorry to interrupt, Stephen, I don't think that's fair. They refined what they were actually doing with student loans. The original judgment about student loans was regarding the utilization of a measure that was about former members of the armed forces, heroes, I think was the phrase used. Then there were further iterations done of that, much as the first time round Trump did it with the travel ban, where he kept going back, and they did eventually get one through.
It brings to the surface every time that there is a clash between the judicial and the executive, there is this looming and very uncomfortable question in American society, which is, make me. Like, what are you going to do to stop me? And we know that the executive branch has all of the power. They have all of the use of force. And it is a very uncomfortable reality of living in this Republican form of government. Now, I do want to take us back in time a little bit to 1993. This is Clinton, don't ask, don't tell. And there's a good example of U.S. District Judge Terry Hatter. So he issued an injunction against the ruling, or not the ruling, but the passage of the rule for don't ask, don't tell from the Clinton Defense Department. And he ordered the reinstatement of Petty Officer Keith Meinhold and put a hold on don't ask, don't tell for a period of time on behalf of that one plaintiff. It ended up going through the courts, and this ended up still going through, and it became, the operating function of the military for well over a decade, 2 decades at least. I think what critics here of what these judges are doing are saying that there needs to be plaintiffs involved in these actions, that when district judges hop in and they just, basically just tweet out, "I don't like what you've done, stop, stop, stop." It works better within the system when they actually are representing a client, that there is a person attached to this case. Otherwise, you do just have judges in random corners, such as this one random district judge who blocked the Obama administration from putting a halt on deportations during his tenure. That you actually don't really have a real rule of law and process here. You just have obstructionism. And that does need to be changed. I think that the Supreme Court can help the entire country figure this out. And that's what the Trump administration is trying to trigger here.
I think it is fair to say that the legal process works better if people have standing to sue, have the capacity to show injury. I mean, there's a whole case about Mahmoud Khalil, which we discussed before, where he obviously can show direct injury. But while I agree on that point, I think it is extraordinarily generous to the Trump administration, given how sweeping its statements have been, to suggest that they're doing it in the service of trying to slightly tweak the judicial process so that we have more plaintiffs showing direct injury.
Yeah, the Trump administration, and really I think this goes back to Project 2025, is most of what has happened in this first month and a half of the administration, it's in the document. You can actually find where they sort of wrote out and laid the groundwork for everything we're seeing here, and this is meant to trigger this conflict. So this is them walking right onto the landmines and saying, we want to relitigate the authority of certain courts in America and their relationship to the executive.
I think we will return to this topic again. I'm sure there's a lot to discuss. And up next, we stick with President Trump, who has fired 2 Democrats from the FTC. Stick with us. President Trump is continuing to shape the executive branch in any way he sees fit.
His latest move was to fire the 2 Democrats on the Federal Trade Commission on Tuesday. A letter sent to one of the fired commissioners reads, "I am writing to inform you that you have been removed from the Federal Trade Commission effective immediately. Your continued service on the FTC is inconsistent with my administration's priorities."
Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, whom the White House fired back in a statement. She said, quote, "Today the President illegally fired me from my position as a Federal Trade Commissioner, violating the plain language of a statute and clear Supreme Court precedent. Why? Because I have a voice, and he is afraid of what I'll tell the American people." Alvaro Bedoya, who was the other FTC member the Trump administration fired, wrote on social media, quote, "I'm a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. The President just illegally fired me." The FTC, he went on, is an independent agency founded 111 years ago to fight fraudsters and monopolists. Our staff is unafraid of the Martin Shkreli's and Jeff Bezoses of the world. They take them to court and win. Now the President wants the FTC to be a lapdog for his golfing buddies. The 2 fired Democrats appear to be citing a 1935 Supreme Court precedent that says the President cannot fire FTC members for policy differences alone. Traditionally, the FTC has 5 members, and in the past, 3 have been a part of the President's party, while the other 2 have not. The agency is tasked with consumer protection and cracking down on antitrust violations.
FTC Chair Andrew Ferguson also chimed in, writing, President Donald J. Trump is the head of the executive branch and is vested with all of the executive power of our government. I have no doubts about his constitutional authority to remove commissioners, which is necessary to ensure democratic accountability for our government. Now, the FTC drew a lot more attention during the tenure of President Biden's FTC chair, Lina Khan. She was known for aggressively pursuing lawsuits against big corporations and introducing novel antitrust theories. Even some conservatives, dubbed conservatives, backed her moves, such as J.D. Vance. Khan hit the campaign trail with multiple Democrats in 2024, including Senator Bernie Sanders, then Senator Ruben Gallego, and a handful of others. Former chief technologist of the FTC, Neil Chilson, wrote on X, "The strongest policy justification for independent agencies has always been their bipartisan apolitical operation. Historically, the FTC has exemplified this ideal. However, the Biden administration undermined this rationale by steering the FTC deep into explicitly political territory. While Congress possesses numerous mechanisms to oversee and check the executive branch, the Constitution does not authorize Congress to combine legislative, judicial, and executive powers into an unaccountable, Frankenstein-like fourth branch of government."
Meanwhile, former Secretary of Labour Robert Reich wrote on Blue Sky, "The FTC has pending lawsuits against Amazon, Meta, and Google. Trump is trying to gut the FTC by firing 2 Democratic commissioners. The National Labour Relations Board is fighting against Amazon and SpaceX in court for violating workers' rights. Trump tried to gut the NLRB." See the problem here? Stephen, I had first word on the last segment, so why don't you tell me what you think of all this?
Yeah, I think what Neil Chilson said was pretty important to point out. Let's take the big picture here first. So the Trump administration, we've talked about relitigating many of the balances of power between the different branches of government, are looking at independent agencies, which arose in the early 20th century and some in the late 19th century, and saying this was always a break with the constitutional order of the United States. Darwinism led to progressivism, which led to this sort of rise of the belief that expert classes and independent agencies, the experts, were going to better make policy in the United States over the legislative branch, where the unwashed masses who represent the people don't make the smartest policies based on facts or evidence. And that's where these agencies come from. There is sort of this fake belief that they can somehow be non-political. And Lina Khan's tenure was a wonderful reminder of just how political these agencies really are. I mean, the language of Slaughter and Bedoya when they're sort of, casting themselves as members of the resistance. I mean, these two people are going to have MSNBC contracts before you know it.
So the only part of that I agree with, I think, is the possibility of them having MSNBC contracts. It does surprise me in this case that conservatives are defending a move that seems to me to breach the separation of powers, which conservatives typically revere, because the FTC was set up by Congress and was the legislation that was enacting it was set up by Congress, and Trump is now proposing to cut across that. And to the point about politicization, it's worth noting, and stick with me here as we go back into time for the Supreme Court case, the precedent that is being cited here, which is beautifully known as Humphrey's Executor versus the United States.
That's a triumphant name.
Which pertains to a former Republican congressman who was appointed to the FTC by a Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, and reappointed by Herbert Hoover. And then FDR came in and said, yeah, I don't really agree with you, you can leave. Yeah. And the reason it's called Humphrey's Executor is then he then died and his next of kin sued for back pay. But the Supreme Court held that it was completely valid to restrict the grounds upon which a president can get rid of a member of the FTC for reasons other than those specifically outlined in the law.
And the Trump firing notice, I think, actually really exposed them. When he said that your priorities do not align with that of my administration, this is a problem. And I think that this will actually lead to real complications for their case in court. So people who view this the way that I do largely see a litigation of an issue that needs to be fought out. This balance of power between the three branches of government and this sort of invisible bureaucratic fourth branch of government needs to be fought. But often the Trump administration does these things in a way that could lead to ultimate defeat. It is not legal to fire them based on policy priorities. You can sort of argue that they are not doing the job, and they're going to have to argue that those two commissioners and the Lina Khan FTC abandoned the purpose of the FTC, which was consumer protection, and reoriented it towards fighting oppressive corporations and the role of corporations in society, which these are fans of the early trust-busting movement. It's very romantic to these people, and you can see it in their language and their objection to being fired. But this might actually reveal to judges who look at this case that they have not been doing what that agency is supposed to do. And that same Supreme Court ruling said that the FTC was quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial,
right.
And it really does set up the FTC for the possibility to be gutted.
I think in defense of the FTC, the most recent figures we have are from 2024, when they returned more than $300 million to consumers. And I think there is, of course, a valid role to be played by those kinds of agencies because, as with the CFPB, often individual citizens do not simply have the financial wherewithal or certainly any legislative leverage to fight against genuine wrongdoing. And that's where I think we probably disagree on the role for regulation itself.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I'm not against the FTC existing. There are certain institutions that are just so baked into American life. I think you need to make the most of them. And the FTC does need to be reoriented towards the consumer welfare standard. And again, under Lina Khan, what the standard became was that antitrust law was going to focus on workers, suppliers, innovators, and entrepreneurs. That's not what the agency is supposed to do. It's what makes going after Amazon so stinking difficult for the FTC, because consumers are actually kind of liking big corporations like Amazon. They have a good relationship to the company. They get things for cheap. And so fighting this out is going to be tough.
You're breaking with the conservatives, though, here, so that's some heterodoxy at least. Up next, Governor Gavin Newsom weighing in on MAGA. Stick with us. There's a clear split within the Democratic Party right now. On one side are Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are touring the country as they seek to rally opposition against the current Trump administration.
Then there is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who is facing major backlash caving to the GOP spending bill. And there is also Gavin Newsom, who is harder to pin down.
On Newsom's podcast, the California governor sat down with his Minnesota counterpart, Tim Walz, pondering what motivates key figures in the MAGA movement. Let's take a look.
I think we have to first understand what their motivations are. I think we have to understand what they're actually doing. And
you don't
I think
think
that's
it's
important.
racism and misogyny?
I think there's a lot of that, but I don't think it's exclusively that. When you talk to a guy like Steve Bannon, he reminded me a little bit of my grandfather when he talks about working folks and he talks about how we hollowed out the industrial core of this country.
But
I understand that. But we can dismiss the notion of election denialism. We could completely dismiss what he did on January 6th, but I don't think you can dismiss what he's saying. Reminds me a lot of what Bernie Sanders was saying. Reminds me a lot of what Democrats said 20, 30 years ago. I mean, he's arguing against.
Newsom went on and on about the godfather of the MAGA movement.
What he's talking about in terms of working folks, what he's talking about from a global construct about what's happened to middle America and rural Americans and why they've lost trust with our party, what he's talking about with what's happening with men in this country and how they've lost their way and how they have significantly higher suicide rates, lives that more despair and isolation. I think those are real issues.
The duo also discussed the notion of masculinity that is propagated by the right. Let's take a look.
This notion of masculinity is deeply part of it. That's one of the, I think it goes, and you can look at the reasons why we've had this sort of dialectic over the Me Too movement. We've had this dialectic even prior to the Me Too movement. This
How
notion
do you fight
of
it?
this
I
notion
think
of
I could kick most of their I do think if they wanted to. I know I can outrun them, but I don't know if we're going to fall into that place where we want to. Okay, we challenge you to a WWE fight here type of thing.
No, but it's a natural reaction. I think it's one of the reasons we're losing so many men.
Newsom reflected upon the current state of the Democratic Party.
It's not that we're not right, but I think we're wrong not to understand more deeply and fully that people think we are deeply full of ourselves and we're talking down to people and past people. People want to be protected, they want to be respected, and they want to be connected. And I think this notion of respect is something that keeps coming back to me. People that just feel like we don't respect them.
Well, Democrats cursing, that's how they communicate.
That's how they win the working class vote back, you know. Bit of profanity and the working class will all flock back to you. Look, I think that I thought that was, in fact, a good discussion. I know it's getting quite a lot of mockery from right-wing Twitter or right-wing X and various other places online that, with right-wing commentators. I think that it was a perfectly fine exchange, particularly on the racism and misogyny and working class concerns point. Because, Walz shot back about the racism and misogyny, and Newsom said, I think there's a lot of that, but it's not only that. I would be more on Newsom's side of that question, I guess, than Walz's. But I think that it is completely valid to point out that I do think there is racism and misogyny, and I've said this before, and we could trace it all the way back to Donald Trump's pre-politics life, the ads calling for the death penalty at the Central Park 5, through the birtherism about Obama, through the phrasing regarding countries that I will get bleeped if I say, but a negative comment about black nations,
let me misogyny. So let's say racism and misogyny exist. It obviously does. I've known some of those people throughout my life, so check. However, as a political strategy, running for national office or even just large states, I've never understood the utility of going out and even talking about those things. Trying to frame people's discontent, their issues, by even invoking those words to describe the public, that's just a real losing strategy. And what I got from that entire conversation, I did listen to it here this morning, was that Newsom is prepared and he gets it and he's ready to go out into the field and start trying to talk to both audiences. And Walz is really still married to this, hashtag resist mindset, like it's still the 2024 election. I really don't think that he is going to continue to rise as a primary Democratic figure.
Two things I would say to that. I do think that it is a bad strategy to only say those things, racism and misogyny, because it gets the Democratic Party off the hook of looking at itself more closely, which it plainly has to do on things like the economy and like its connection to working class voters. That's a serious concern. I just would be less unequivocal than you would be about, it's a losing strategy, because the Democratic Party obviously gets still the majority of non-white voters in this country to vote for it, and a greater share of women than share of men to vote for it. And if the Democratic Party is not going to stand up for the rights of women, the rights of black people, Hispanic people, and so forth, then what's it there for? You run the risk then of enervating or disillusioning your base, which is a problem that the Democratic Party has anyway.
Came back to that often. Throughout the interview, he kept bringing up a woman's right to choose. And in one of the sound bites that we didn't pick up, he mentions that I can't talk to people. How do I even communicate to people who don't believe in a woman's right to choose? Right there, you have the evidence of the communication problem and the inability to acknowledge that this is a divisive issue, which really splits the country quite evenly, the issue of abortion, and B, the framing of it, that we are not just talking about a woman's right to choose, we're talking about a baby's right to live. And that is the divide that you have to engage with. And Walz just seems completely unwilling to even acknowledge that people don't think about it in his framework. And until he gets that, and I think until Democrats get that this is a divisive issue and women's right to choose is not always the way people look at it, they will continue to run right into a brick wall on their communication.
The abortion question is a really interesting one, because you're right in that public opinion has not shifted over time really all that much on abortion. It's very different to something like, say, same-sex marriage, or in a previous generation, interracial marriage, which are essentially topics that we as a society have decided. And abortion, we haven't in the same way. That being said, obviously in the wake of Roe v. Wade, those next midterms showed significant gains, or Democrats doing significantly better than expected, which I think pointed to an overly harsh or dogmatic Republican line on those things. I think we're almost out of time here, actually, but I do think that one of the dangers of Walz's view, even though I would defend it to a degree, is it kind of glosses over that economic argument, that connection with the economically disaffected, and I don't think that is a good strategy for the Democratic Party.
We'll leave it at that.
We have an agreement in some way. Up next, we'll talk to a Boeing whistleblower who just won't quit. Stay tuned. The safety of flying is top of mind these days for obvious reasons. Ed Pierson, a former senior manager at a Boeing 737 MAX factory, won't stop talking. And that's because the ex-Boeing employee turned whistleblower has spent the last 7 years calling out what he thinks were serious flaws in the aerospace giant's production processes. He's been trying to draw the attention of Congress and federal agencies, and he's even gone before Congress to testify about Boeing's slew of deadly failures and near disasters.
Pierson, one-man mission for Boeing Descent, counsels families of crash victims and other whistleblowers. Joining us now to elaborate is Ed Pierson, the executive director of the Foundation for Aviation Safety and the host of Warning Bells podcast. Thanks for joining us, Ed.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's nice for you to be with us. So please give us the latest in your mission as a whistleblower and taking this message out to Congress and anybody who will hear it. What has changed and progressed positively in your campaign?
Well, I want to tell you right away that it's never really been just my campaign. There's a lot of people that are interested in aviation safety, and obviously a lot more seems to be more interested today. But it's a team of people, actually. And last week, we joined forces with accident victim family members, individuals that lost loved ones on one of the two Boeing MAX accidents, the one in Ethiopia, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. And we met with members of Congress, congressional staffers, legislative staff. We had several meetings with them last week, and we talked to them, and everybody was interested in the same question: is it safe to fly? And our response is, first of all, you have to understand there's a human cost of this. These are real people. These aren't numbers, right? And quite honestly, we're tired of the platitudes of everything is fine, there's nothing wrong, and they quote all these statistics, but those statistics have never really prevented accidents or saved anybody. And what we're talking about is currently what's happening. You know, we really are not that interested in past statistics. We're just interested in making things safe. And so the positive news, I'd say, is that when we met with these staffers, they were very receptive to the recommendations that not only the victim family members had, but us from the Foundation for Aviation Safety. And our recommendation is, and I hope this makes sense, but it seems like these types of incidents and accidents come in waves, and there's a flurry of activity and a bunch of media interest and a bunch of congressional interest, and a bunch of promises are made and a bunch of promises are broken, and then it fades like the tide. You know, it just kind of recedes back, and people forget about it, go back to their normal day of business, and then you know, wait for the next one to come in, and we repeat the process. And it's complacency that what we see. You know, the reason we're so successful for all these years is because people worked hard for millions of people worked hard for decades to make it safer. So the positive news is we came in and we said, look, we need to do something different. The family members had a meeting with Secretary Duffy a couple weeks ago, and they expressed to him an interest in creating an interagency task force with representatives from the different government agencies, that this would be a team of people working 24/7 around the clock to identify issues, to analyze the issues, and to make recommendations that can actually occur. We think a focused effort like that will allow people to, these agencies, and it's not just Boeing, the manufacturer. I mean, we want Boeing to be successful. It's important to our country and our national security, but we also want safe planes. and we have to have safe planes into the future, and other countries are depending on us as well. So I think the positive news is there seems to be real interest in creating this interagency task force of experts. This is not for industry people to be on. This is for government, Department of Transportation, FAA, NTSB, DOD, the organizations that have Department of Commerce, those organizations. And we think that there's some positive traction on that, and we think that's a good way to go. It's certainly better than just continuing to expect something to change when nothing changes. It's just the same old routine.
Sure. And I just want to explain for people who do not have your level of expertise in aerospace engineering what your case is as it pertains to Boeing, because obviously I've no expertise in that area. So let me just, correct me if I'm wrong, as I try to summarize this for people who don't, are not in the minutiae of this world. There were 2 Boeing MAX crashes in late 2018 and early 2019. Tragically, there were more than 100 people killed in each one. And as I understand it, there is broad agreement that a sensor malfunctioned, and so the planes went downwards when they really shouldn't have. And the point of contention is, as I take it, why that sensor malfunctioned. And Boeing has said it's a bird strike, and one of your concerns, having worked at Boeing and having seen the production line, was there was a lot of pressure to put as many planes out as possible. That led to a kind of chaos or disorganization which lowered safety standards, and that may have contributed to electrical or wiring faults that were in fact the reason why the sensor went awry and those planes crashed. Is that, in summary, basically your case, your theory?
That's a pretty good summary. There's more to it. If I could elaborate maybe a bit. You're right that the NTSB and the government agencies, the FAA, and certainly Boeing, they concluded that this was a MCAS software failure, maneuvering characteristic augmentation system software that caused the plane to pitch down. And there's documentaries and tons of, thousands of news stories about this. My issue has always been what caused the angle of attack sensor to fail. And in the case of this particular plane that we're talking about, ET-302, U.S. authorities are saying that it was a bird that hit the sensor exactly at that spot at exactly at that time. But what they are doing is they're completely ignoring really irrefutable evidence that is coming out that shows that that plane and the Lion airplane both had electrical and electronic failures before they crashed, serious electrical issues. In fact, the second reason we met with the Congress last week was we wanted to tell them that the NTSB Chair Homedy received documents from us. We received documents, official Boeing and FAA documents, just over the summer, and we passed them immediately to the NTSB. And these documents clearly show, in the case of this plane, that it had electrical issues when it was being built. I worked in a factory, as you mentioned, while we were building these planes during this time frame. I had just retired just before the accident, and it was an absolute chaos mess. We had tons of out of sequence work. There was tons of reports of quality issues. And the accident investigators were never afforded the opportunity to go in and investigate manufacturing. And, myself and others were screaming, saying, this was really a place you need to go. It was a 2-month-old and a 4-month-old plane that crashed. And they didn't do that. They went instead and, fixated on, the MCAS software and the pilot training, which clearly played a huge role. But we wanted to know what else really caused these accidents. And so I've written several reports. These documents that we shared, those documents by international standards, ICAO stands for International Civil Aviation Organization, Annex 13 standards. These are the guidelines on how accident investigations are supposed to occur, clearly show that anything that is considered relevant information, and some of these documents are production records of the actual airplane as it was being built. It shows that they were having problems installing the electrical wiring interconnect system, or EWIS. It showed that they had parts issues, mislabeled parts, misinstalled parts. There was at the same week, if you can believe it, the same week the Ethiopian plane was being built in Renton, Washington factory up north at the Everett site at the electrical center. They had a FAA investigation underway for whistleblowers who claimed that the site, which was building electrical components, had actually completely lost control of the quality of the parts, and they were working defective parts. And then there was probably the most damning report, which we passed, was when the plane was only a couple weeks old, it was coming in to land at 1,000 feet above the ground, and it had an uncommanded roll. The Ethiopians were concerned about this, and they asked Boeing, and we had these records. We shared these are the records I'm talking about. Went to Boeing and said, "Hey, we had this incident. Can you help us troubleshoot it?" And after going back and forth, eventually Boeing said, "Send us the flight data recorder information." And again, this is the plane that later crashed a couple months later. And they sent the data to them, and they came back, and Boeing said that they suspect that there's an intermittent electrical fault in the wiring. And these documents that I just described to you very briefly, none of those were shared with international accident investigators or criminal investigators. And this is just further evidence that those airplanes definitely had manufacturing defects in them. And what we're seeing today, and that was again, one of the things we were discussing with congressional staff, is there's a long list of defects, of engineering and manufacturing defects that have come to light on this particular plane since the FAA conducted its 20-month, comprehensive recertification.
Yeah. And
and it's right on our website.
We've only
so
got about a minute here, but I just wanted to ask you before we go out, and this is a sensitive question. I'm just asking because a lot of people in our audience, I think, would want this asked of you and to get your take on this, because whistleblower safety is no joke. It's a real thing across any high-wire industry, agency, government. As you've been doing this campaign since 2018 or so, have you felt safe and secure in going through this process and working on this issue?
Look, that's a decision that individual whistleblowers make with their families, and my family stands behind me. They know that this is important to our country. It's important to the world, and so we're going to continue to communicate. We want Boeing to be successful. We want our government agencies to be successful. So our focus is on discussing what's currently happening out there and helping drive changes to improve safety. So that's really where our focus is.
Ed, just very finally, and we literally have about 1 minute left here, in relation to the flaws that you believe happened with Boeing, you obviously think that Boeing or the aircraft industry generally is a little too close to regulators and so forth. Do you have confidence, in short, that is going to change?
No, not if we continue doing what we're doing and expecting different results. It's not going to change. It requires a completely different, first of all, it requires integrity and admitting that these problems exist. And you can't fix problems unless you don't admit that they exist. There's documents that I want to just tell you about. The NTSB is not sharing those documents with the parties to the investigation, which is, again, against international regulations. So we just want the proper investigation so we can get to the truth and really, move forward. At this point, we are encouraged by what we're hearing from Secretary Duffy and the congressional staffers. They were very encouraging. So we hope that they actually take these recommendations to heart.
Ed Pierson, it has been a real pleasure to have you on Rising. Thanks for giving us your time, and I hope we talk again.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Is Elon Musk wearing out his welcome at the White House? According to journalist Tara Palmeri, the answer is yes. In a recent Substack post, Palmeri recounts a disastrous interview Musk gave to Larry Kudlow. During that conversation, Musk suggested cuts to entitlements. And of course, he had previously called Social Security the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time during an interview with Joe Rogan. The White House quickly scrambled after the Kudlow interview, and their press shop released a fact-check memo. They denied Musk meant that he was aiming to eliminate Social Security.
Palmeri talked to staffers and sources from within the White House for her behind-the-scenes report. Many expressed growing disgruntled with Musk for his dismissive demeanor, frequently boasting about his billions, and even crossing White House Chief of Staff Susie Walz. Don't do that. So are Musk's days numbered? Here to elaborate on what she's uncovered is Tara Palmeri, an investigative journalist and author of the Red Letter Substack. Welcome, Tara.
Thanks for having me. It's so great to finally be on the show. I've been watching you, so it's really cool to sit here with you both.
Well, congratulations on your new chapter. So I would love to hear your take on whether Musk is fighting for his survival in this White House, or if he's just along for the ride as a guy who really doesn't need this, but he's sort of put his brand and reputation forward as a almost sacrifice to achieve certain goals. Is he trying to hold on here?
I don't think there's any risk to Elon Musk within the White House. So as much as the staffers, even to the cabinet official level, cannot stand him, they also fear him. He's the richest person in the world by many times. President Trump is keeping him around. President Trump doesn't mind him. I mean, he's a little clingy, but he just gave him $100 million for his political action committees. And, this is Trump's ability to make sure, A, that his agenda is passed, to try to maintain a majority in the House so that he can continue being an effective president and not a lame duck, but also to go on from this stage in his life into being a party boss, the type of party boss that he grew up seeing in New York City. So as long as Elon Musk continues to donate to Donald Trump, he's not going anywhere. Now, there is going to be friction. Susie Wiles, as I reported, complained to Donald Trump about this. She said, he can't be freelancing anymore. And you've seen him being reined in recently too. Trump said, no more sledgehammer. You need to use a scalpel. And you saw the cabinet secretaries. The New York Times reported that they were very aggressive with him for trying to cut into their agencies. Sean Duffy, the transportation secretary, said, do not try to fire my air traffic controllers. You try to do that. We don't have enough. And so people are starting, the emotions are definitely rising towards Musk, but ultimately they're going to have to play cleanup duty for him. He's going to freelance and he's going to do what he wants with Doge, but it doesn't matter. And as long as he keeps, donating to President Trump, and as long as President Trump decides that he wants him around, and it seems like he doesn't mind him.
To that very point, Tara, one of the things that I've always been struck by is how much Trump, through really all of his life, has been very concerned about perceptions of him and media coverage of him. Yeah, he does the kind of macho thing, but he's obviously very thin-skinned about criticism. And that's why I'm skeptical sometimes of people who do forecast this imminent falling out between Musk and Trump. Because I've certainly spoken to people who theorize that part of Trump's draw to Musk isn't just the money. It's the fact that through the ownership of X, Musk has this massive megaphone. And so you might want to keep him on board just the way a president from a previous generation would want to keep a media baron on board. Do you think there's anything to that idea?
Absolutely. I mean, Musk is a very powerful person. I wouldn't be surprised if President Trump was a little afraid of him too. Something he'd probably never admit. But there is no reason to get on Musk's bad side. This person has so much money. He gave $250 million to his campaign. It's a historic record amount. And Trump admires him for being rich. The issue is that the people who are below Trump, he's extremely dismissive to them, like the chief of staff, who is the second most powerful person in Washington, some might argue. He treats her, according to my source, as an effing secretary. Another source said that he treats cabinet officials, cabinet secretaries, like messenger boys. And he does very weird things, like sleeping on a cot in his office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building with guards outside, 5 guards. So yeah, he's an odd bird to manage, and you can only imagine what it's like to be the chief of staff and have to, take incoming calls from members of Congress and the Senate, from cabinet officials saying, why is he cutting my programs? What am I going to tell my constituents? How do I keep my department running? And who are they calling? They're not going to call President Trump. They're not calling Elon Musk. They're calling Susie Wiles. And so how is she supposed to do her job? And, she's a survivor. She would never go directly against Musk, but there's tension. I mean, she has to do her job, and he's making it harder. It's like having a two-headed president.
I remember at the beginning of the new administration, there were a couple of reports about Susie Wiles and the tight ship she was going to run. No leaking, no backbiting, everybody kind of going through her funnel. Obviously, it's never that simple. And, part of your reporting to me is, I think, an element of the thing that we tend to see. Big egos, a lot of really big personalities clashing in the most powerful building in the world. So kind of for you, what is the thing that stands out as this is different than kind of what we've seen before with previous administrations throughout history?
I mean, I think that Susie Wiles was aware going into this that you can never truly be a gatekeeper to Donald Trump. So many people have his phone number. They can call him and talk to him at any time. He's often the biggest leaker because of that. He doesn't really want to be controlled. One of my colleagues, Mark Caputo, she says the MAGA serenity prayer, which is accept the things you cannot change and know the difference. And so she knows when to fight and when not to, and that's how she's been a survivor. But she also has a very top-heavy organization, a lot of deputies who report to her who are exceptionally loyal to her. They are more loyal to her, you could argue, than they are to Elon Musk. And I just think that they did not think that Elon Musk was going to go the distance in the sense that he would literally be sitting and standing next to Trump at every opportunity, that there were going to be two people there. And Elon Musk freelances. He does what he wants. And so it's just not an easy position to be in, to have to deal with, a president who, in a lot of ways, freelances compared to conventional, presidencies, and someone who's just sending out messages on X to 200 million followers, who has control over not just the US, but major corporations around the world, has, a lot of political influence in now Europe and smaller countries where he's starting to invest. I mean, this is a very, very powerful person. You're not managing just one powerful person, you're managing two right now. And it's almost hard to tell which one is more powerful.
Tara, I want to ask, just in terms of what your sources have been telling you, it seems to me that there are several reasons why people in the White House would have a resistance or a anguish about Musk. One is the policy, whether it's the cuts we mentioned, or you mentioned Sean Duffy. In the intro, we mentioned the Social Security comments. Then separate from that, there's the organizational element, what you mentioned as his propensity for freelancing. And then there's just his personality where people think he's a bit of a essentially. So, what is driving? I mean, that's, we could put it more politely, I suppose, but that's what
he's dismissive.
Really
he
say.
told the cabinet secretaries when he started that meeting, I created billion-dollar businesses. What have you done in your life?
Right.
And Scott Besson is a very successful person on Wall Street. Howard Lutnick ran Cantor Fitzgerald. Linda McMahon created the WWE network. I mean, these are no slouches that are cabinet officials. And so, I agree. That's definitely part of it as well. One thing that I found to be so interesting as well is that I talked to Trump's personal pollster, and I asked him, what are you seeing in the polls for Elon Musk? He's never polled him at all.
Right.
Which suggests to me that they're afraid of him or hurting his ego. But in the public polling, you see that Musk's favorabilities are diving. He's obviously a political liability to President Trump. So why wouldn't they be polling him? It just suggests that there is a different treatment of Musk. I mean, they polled Trump, that's his client.
Yeah, and Tara,
but to have
I was
never
at the
polled him?
Department of Education last week, and I was kind of looking at some of the protesters. There were only a handful, really, at the inklings that there were going to be these huge layoffs, and then they occurred. Most of the signs had Elon's face on them. He is the heat shield. He's taking all of the incoming arrows here. There was hardly any anti-Trump signs or paint sprayed on the sidewalk. It's all about Elon. And that might be the point. Is this a strategy?
You could definitely see that Elon Musk takes the heat off President Trump. I mean, we're talking about Elon Musk most of the time when we're talking about Elon Musk. I'm sure President Trump doesn't mind it because, like you mentioned, he is very aware of his media coverage. He wants to be loved. And if this person is willing to do the hard stuff and then he can say, oh, I had to reel Elon back in, that would be, preferable for him. They have a very strange relationship too. I think Elon really looks up to him though as like a father figure. And Trump doesn't seem to mind it. The only thing about Elon Musk is that he is always next to Trump. And Trump does not like that. I mean, even with his wives, kids, grandchildren, he does not like clingy people, and Elon is everywhere. But he does serve a purpose, you could say. And if a Doge cut doesn't go well, who gets blamed for it?
Tara Palmeri, great reporting, great conversation. We really appreciate you joining us here on Rising.
Cool.
And there's also drama churning at Ben & Jerry's. We'll tell you more coming up. In a not-so-sweet scenario, Ben & Jerry's CEO David Stever has been ousted.
Ben & Jerry's is claiming that its parent company, Unilever, fired Stever for the ice cream giant's political social media posts.
A lawsuit that Ben & Jerry's has filed against Unilever says that Stever's ouster was not about his performance history. Ben & Jerry's say Unilever violated the merger agreement by not consulting the board's advisory committee before trying to get rid of the CEO. The ice cream maker writes, Unilever announced their decision before the committee had even been appointed and attempted to force the independent board into rubber stamping the decision by unilaterally dictating artificial and hasty deadlines.
Activism, of course, is a Ben & Jerry's part of their DNA. You know, since as early as 1988, they've named ice cream flavors based on political and social causes.
For instance, in 2008, they had a flavor called Yes Pecan, which was a pun, as if you hadn't noticed, referencing Barack Obama's Yes We Can slogan. One of their more recent ones was Kamala's Coconut Jubilee, a nod to former Vice President Kamala Harris.
Meanwhile, Unilever told CNN that the firing was in line with the terms of the acquisition agreement. Ben & Jerry's has complained in the past that Unilever has stopped making the ice cream maker from posting social media messages that regard politics. For instance, Ben & Jerry's alleged in January that Unilever barred them from posting about abortion, universal health care, and climate change. The ice cream maker argues that this was due to the posts mentioning Trump.
Ben & Jerry's also alleges that Unilever blocked them from posting about Mahmoud Khalil, the student whose green card was revoked for what the White House said was aligned with Hamas activities.
Do shoppers even want the companies they buy from posting about politics? Well, a Harris poll in February found that 38% of Americans are avoiding buying from brands that differ politically from them. 45% of those were Democrat, and 34% were Republican.
A related Gallup Bentley University survey showed that fewer Americans want companies to take political stances. For instance, in 2022, 48% of Americans said companies should take public political stances. But by 2024, that number had dropped to 38%.
Oh man, the tide is turning on the politicization of brands.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, poor Ben & Jerry's, you see, this is what happens when you sell out to the man. You just get caught in these corporate stances that avoid any kind of point of principle. Ben & Jerry's was sold to Unilever back in 2000 for more than $300 million, and Unilever seemingly trying to enforce their control.
I don't understand this move. If we take the fired CEO at his word and kind of what people are saying, that this was about politics and Unilever's discomfort, I don't really get why you would have bought Ben & Jerry's in the first place. This is what they do. I am a conservative. Ben & Jerry's is fantastic. I have at least 2 right now in my freezer.
Good.
This is just what they do. I will never forget their Colin Kaepernick changed the world brand ice cream that was around Black Lives Matter. This is just part of the Ben & Jerry's thing. It always has been. So I don't even know what would be over the line for that brand. I find what they do and their social media presence to be a little cringy, but I also don't spend my money based on my political opinions. That's just not how I do things as a consumer.
I think that is admirable, and I think that, it is completely right to say Ben & Jerry's have been very identified with progressive causes. Now, I think that what makes an ice cream company successful is whether or not it makes nice ice cream, right? I mean, ultimately, is the product something people want to buy? If it was terrible, people are not going to go out and buy it because it is aligned with political views that they agree with. I do think that, I think that it's quite fair and right for you to say, I don't align with, you don't buy things in terms of alignment with political beliefs. But are there lines that corporations could cross where you would be like, I just can't?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the instances that was most difficult for me was the politicization around Disney. And Disney as a corporate family brand, I would say that they were historically considered to be pretty apolitical as a company. They began to run into real complications over the past 4 to 5 years with comments made that were revealed by people like Christopher Rufo, who managed to get leaks from inside Disney meetings. You know, when people at the very highest levels of creative were saying that there's some sort of not so secret gay agenda within, you know, Disney programming and the writing of shows. And, you know, you have that coming up, and then there were instances of transgender individuals playing princesses in the parks, and you just go, oh my gosh, I can't reward this kind of stuff with my dollars. You have to draw a line in the sand somewhere. But you know, I think, like, for instance, Starbucks' main right-wing challenger is Black Rifle Coffee. I want to like Black Rifle Coffee, but it's not that exceptional, so I'm not going to buy it. There are just certain things where if you don't have the market cornered on a thing, I'm not going to just vote with my dollars and walk away.
So it's interesting that we have commonalities in our general approach and predictable differences in where we draw the line, or in the companies and where we draw the line. I don't know if my daughter will be watching Rising today, but for years I refused to buy her Chick-fil-A with my money. She could buy it with her own money if she liked, because I dislike their opposition to same-sex marriage and things like that.
Yeah, Chick-fil-A is the most popular brand in my house.
This is the other thing about it is my daughter loves the chicken so much that even though she would be broadly aligned with my views, she would
now start
boycott
talking
Chick-fil-A.
about our kids, but my daughter loves the vibe of Chick-fil-A. They're the friendliest, you know, they're the kind of most neighborly in the way they serve, and it does reflect in how people go. It's mostly church groups and sports teams that go to Chick-fil-A, but I'm looking at this right now, they're one of the most polarizing brands in America. 71% of support comes from people who identify as conservative. That aligns with Cabela's, and that also aligns with Fox News. You know, people do sort out their consumption of these brands based on their political viewpoints, and there are other places to get chicken. You know?
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, though. I'm not... I mean, that is a particular choice that I make in relation to Chick-fil-A. I'm not someone who typically scrutinizes every single thing I spend $1 on to determine if it is aligned with my political beliefs. Yeah. It is well known to anyone who watches this show that I'm fairly sympathetic to the cause of the Palestinians. A lot of people who are sympathetic to that cause boycott Starbucks. I don't, because I'm not quite sure exactly what Starbucks' sin is supposed to be in that regard. So, you know, it is about where you draw the line. So.
Yeah, I think one of the most healthy things that has happened on the right in, let's just say, the past 10 years is that the right has started to try to build alternative institutions and brands, and instead of just boycotting brands they don't like for being woke and saying go woke, go broke, and this and that, building things that are an alternative. You know, the Daily Wire launched Bent Key Children's Entertainment. They poured tens of millions, hundreds of millions into building animated entertainment for kids and families that you can enjoy via streaming, and basically saying, if you are mad at Disney and you want to show them you're serious, why don't you sign up for Bent Key? And there's an element of that I like because it's constructive and it's about building so that you have market competition. But then there's another element that I dislike, which is that we have cartoons for conservative families and cartoons for liberal families, and that's just not the world that I want to live in.
Right, it just deepens the divide.
Yeah.
Which we try and transcend here on Rising.
Of course.
Of course we do. Up next, the Big Apple's rotten mayoral candidates. Both of the leading contenders have scandals in their past. Stick with us for that. Is New York City in a bad enough state to welcome back Andrew Cuomo? With just 3 months to go before the primary, Cuomo, the former New York governor, is overshadowing other mayoral contenders, and that's frustrating New Yorkers who want fresh leadership. Incumbent Mayor Eric Adams is trailing far behind Cuomo in the polls. According to one recent polling average, the scandal-laden Cuomo is leading the multi-candidate pack with 33.8% support. The current mayor, Mr. Adams, is a distant second with 10.4%. Among the other contenders, none is drawing more than 9%.
Can Andrew Cuomo really make a comeback? Polls indicate nearly half of voters view him negatively.
Here to tell us what's going on in the Big Apple mayoral contest is Molly Ball. Molly is a senior political correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. And welcome to Rising, Molly.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
So obviously Andrew Cuomo has two fairly significant drags on his popularity, to put it mildly. One, the numerous complaints about sexually inappropriate behaviour, and the second one being his record on COVID, particularly as it pertains to nursing homes in the state of New York. But as we just noted, he's way ahead in the polls. So what do you think is propelling his current poll standing?
Well, it's a very interesting dynamic in this race because, as you say, Cuomo has really overshadowed the rest of the field. And a lot of that is simply because he is so much better known than any of the other candidates, with the exception of the badly damaged incumbent Eric Adams, who, of course, is himself under indictment and involved in this whole controversy with the Trump administration over whether his federal charges will be dropped in his corruption investigation. So multiple sources who I spoke to in the course of my reporting on this race expressed the sentiment, this is why we can't have nice things. That these two men with all of their baggage have so overshadowed the other candidates who have no such baggage, but who are just not managing to break out of the pack, in part because there are so many of them, and in part because they simply are not as big names. New Yorkers are not as familiar with them, so they are having trouble getting people's attention. Now, these would seem to be qualified candidates. You have a couple of citywide elected officials, a current and a former comptroller of the city. You have several current or former state legislators, members of the state assembly and senate. The speaker of the city council also recently got in the race. So there would seem to be a sort of wealth of qualified options who don't have all that baggage, but none of them have managed to break out of the pack. It is still early. There's a lot of campaigning still to be done. Many of my sources believe that Cuomo's frontrunner status is fragile, but it's hard to know at this point who has the ability to break out of that crowded pack.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like name recognition from holding office previously to get you at least, across the finish line with this kind of stuff. But Molly, can you tell me a little bit about how he is talking out on the trail, what kind of issue positions he's taking, and if Cuomo has been realigning politically? Because he seems to me to be the kind of shrewd politician, like your Gavin Newsom out in California, who would try to sort of seize the moment and change his tune on some major issues. Or is he just same old Andrew Cuomo?
I think it's a really good point that this is not just name recognition, that Cuomo is presenting himself as a problem solver, a pragmatist, someone who, everybody knows he's got this big personality and his critics accuse him of being a bully. But what he's saying is, I know how to get things done, that I see what has to be done. He is describing the city as being in crisis, and he's saying his experience is as a crisis manager. He denies that he did anything wrong in his management of COVID. He says that was a crisis that he managed. That is his experience as a crisis manager. He also denies wrongdoing in the scandal that led to him resigning in disgrace, and he claims that none of those women's claims were true who accused him of sexual harassment. We'll see whether voters believe him. But so much of his pitch is about the idea that he's a doer and a pragmatist. And he's also positioning himself as a more moderate Democrat. And as governor, he frequently played off of the left wing of the Democratic Party, although he also was responsible for some of the liberal initiatives that some critics now blame for example, the city's crime problems, including bail reform. But he's saying that, he is a moderate and a pragmatist, as opposed to some of these more left-wing candidates. And he has particularly promised to stand up for Israel, as opposed to some other candidates who have been more critical.
Molly, you point out in your piece that Cuomo's off to a pretty prodigious start in terms of fundraising. He's raised about $1.5 million in the first couple of weeks of his campaign. And you also note that he does have, institutional support, big name endorsers. Some labor unions have come out for him. But you also draw a comparison that I think is really interesting and which I had forgotten about, which is, your point is that being the early frontrunner is not much guarantee of anything in New York City mayoral elections. And you cite Christine Quinn, who perhaps many non-New Yorkers may have almost forgotten about. But she was the frontrunner back in 2013. She was the Speaker of the New York City Council at the time. And Bill de Blasio came from almost nowhere in the polls to defeat her. So that sort of example, I think, does demonstrate that Cuomo is by no means a shoo-in for this office, right?
That's right. The history suggests that New York Democratic primary voters don't like anointed candidates. They don't like inevitable frontrunners. And there has been a tendency for that seemingly inevitable frontrunner to be eclipsed in the final weeks of the race. De Blasio 12 years ago is one example, but even 4 years ago. And Eric Adams was not the frontrunner until very late in the campaign, if ever. And it was the businessman Andrew Yang who was the seemingly inevitable frontrunner in the early going of the campaign at this point, in fact, 4 years ago. So there's a long history. There's also some quirks to get in the weeds a little bit to this race. For example, there's a very strong donation matching program in New York City, which means that even many of these minor candidates will have money to get their message out, even though their fundraising is not anywhere near what the kind of war chest that Andrew Cuomo is going to have. They will have some money to get their message out because they have qualified for this 8 times matching that the New York City campaign finance system entitles them to.
Well,
So there's a long way to go in this race, even though there's only 3 months until the primary. And most people watching this race don't think that it's going to stay exactly where it is right now.
Molly, just to broaden this out to a kind of national level, Cuomo, as I understand it from this distance, has been to some degree making nice with President Trump, or at least saying that he could have a constructive relationship with him. But obviously they've had a very volatile relationship in various ways. If Cuomo were to win, do you have any sense of what that Cuomo-Trump dynamic would look like?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, one of the things I'm really watching in the mayoral campaign is to what degree President Trump will be an issue. You know, this is a Democratic primary. Democrats are not particularly happy with the Trump administration in this moment. Both Eric Adams and, to some extent, Andrew Cuomo have been less than aggressive against President Trump and his administration. Is that what Democratic voters want to see right now, or is it going to become an issue? The other candidates have been calling out Andrew Cuomo, saying that he is not tough enough on Trump and that what New York City needs is the mayor who's going to stand up to Trump, stand up to the Trump administration. You know, we see the Trump administration withdrawing federal funding from New York City, taking money away from Columbia University, going after congestion pricing. So it'll be really interesting to see whether Democratic primary voters in this race want to see a mayor who's going to be more aggressive against Trump. Now, if Cuomo wins, how would he approach Trump? I think that's a question he's going to get asked a lot on the campaign trail, and he's going to have to answer whether he wants to, you know, put that in more pragmatic terms or whether he wants to be seen as more of a fighter.
Molly, you mentioned lesser known candidates taking part in the matching of contributions. One of those is State Senator Zelnor Myrie, received a pretty glowing write-up in Matt Iglesias' slow, boring newsletter on Substack, and really about a candidate advancing the housing issue and YIMBYism in New York City. Has housing risen to be important to voters in this primary process, or is it just all about resisting Trump? I have to believe that there's bread and butter issues on the table, such as building more homes for people to live in and crime, of course.
Yeah. No, almost all of the discussion in this race has been about those bread and butter issues. Very little of it has been about national issues and Donald Trump. The candidates have mostly been talking about their proposals to improve New Yorkers' quality of life. You know, New Yorkers are very pessimistic in this moment. Now, the incumbent, Eric Adams, claims that this perception that the city has simultaneously become less safe, less livable, and more expensive. They claim that that's not true. They point to statistics that they say shows that the Adams administration has made headway on these problems, but New Yorkers by and large feel that, they can't afford rent, they can't afford housing, and the subway feels dangerous, the streets feel dangerous. It's just not a good time to be a resident of New York City in quality of life terms. And all of the candidates are making promises to address that, and housing has been a big focus. Now, there's a wide range of policy solutions that the candidates are offering. I think you're right that Myrie, who's a state senator from Brooklyn, has advanced the most sort of yes in my backyard type of platform, whereas you have other candidates talking more about things like rent freezes. The left-wing candidates are on Mamdani promising a citywide rent freeze, and other candidates promising other forms of rent control. So all of the candidates are saying that they would both build more housing and bring rents down. And this is what most of the conversation on the campaign trail has been about.
Molly Ball of the Wall Street Journal, thanks so much for joining us on Rising.
Thank you.
Coming up next, the Global Happiness Index is out. We'll tell you where the US landed next. We always ask the big questions here at Rising. So, Stephen Kent, are you happy?
I'm always happy when I'm here with you now.
Well, there we go. That's the perfect answer. But it does put you out of step, apparently, with a lot of Americans, because the annual World Happiness Report came out today. And I'll tell you who isn't happy: the United States at large. The US has fallen to its lowest ever ranking in the annual report put out by Gallup and its partners. America now ranks 24th, one spot lower than last year. According to the report, young people under 30 are driving the downward shift, and that's because many do not believe they have the freedom to choose what to do with their lives. That category of happiness has fallen 10 points in just the past 4 years between 2020 and 2024. The report measures how benevolence and social connections have positive impacts on people's lives. One factor highlighted in the report was the increasing number of people who eat alone. In 2023, roughly 1 in 4 Americans reported eating all of their meals alone the previous day, an increase of 53% since 2003. Dining alone has become more prevalent for every age group, but especially for young people.
So who is happy, Niall?
Well, let's take a look at who's on top. The win in the happiness stakes goes to the Nordic countries again: Finland, Denmark, Iceland, not sure if it's officially Nordic or not, but we'll call them that, and Sweden. Moving up, Mexico and Costa Rica are rising on the charts to 8 and 10 respectively.
Fascinating. So people are not vibing on America these days.
No.
Yeah, this tends to be a trend. So I am looking at this list, and I'm thinking, what's at the top? We got Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, Israel. There's something that they all have in common, which there is social safety nets, and there's sort of a robust social welfare state. There's high tax. Everybody loves to talk about it. High taxes, high amounts of services. So there's sort of a feeling, a baseline level of security in those societies. There is also a relatively more intact system of people having children, getting married underneath the age of 35. That's particularly the case in Israel. There's children everywhere. But I'll tell you what I think unites the people at the top: adverse conditions. A lot of these nations are frigid, cold, rough to live in. It's not all about sunshine, warmth, and good vibes and the environment you're in. There's a culture within the people of all these countries of going through a kind of struggle together and a gratitude for the things that are good despite living in challenging places. And this has a lot to do with how people actually think of and process their own degrees of happiness. Is what are they grateful for? It plays a big role. And U.S., very free, very prosperous. I would never say that we are a super gracious country. I think we always want more, more, more.
So that's an interesting theory or thesis. The issue of prosperity and adversity, though, is interesting because there are an enormous number of Americans who face very serious adversity in their lives, materially and otherwise. A lot of people struggling with cost of living and all of that. Now, it is true that most Americans are vastly better off than most people in the most benighted regions of the world. But I wonder, to your point, whether the inequalities of American life actually tear at that kind of fabric of unity or satisfaction or commonality that you're alluding to in those other countries.
I mean, I don't know if inequalities in America fuel that, but I will say that we are a country that is very much driven towards accumulation. It's the capitalist mindset of this country to rise, to succeed, to grow your income, and as a result, in capitalist societies, you do have a lot of bifurcation between the people who have a lot and the people who have very little. And that hunger for the American dream, though, is a big part of why people come here. There's a spirit here of not settling for a baseline. I've got some friends in Britain, and there's just this very interesting culture there of when people rise beyond their station, it's like they've committed a taboo and they've exceeded where they came from as a child. And,
This is a complete tangent, but it does somewhat go to that point. When I first came to this country, I was accustomed to the default answer when someone asks you in Ireland or Britain, how are you? The default answer is not bad. And when Americans would ask me that question and I would say not bad, they would look at me with great concern as to how things were, what, is that all? And so I have had to get accustomed to the American tendency to say things are great, they're fantastic, which if you said in Ireland or Britain, you would be regarded, I think, as tooting your own horn to an excessive degree or being a little bit too happy.
That is so interesting. So one of the people that I read a lot on this issue is Arthur Brooks of Harvard University. He recently did one of his newest books with Oprah that has a lot to do with happiness, and he also has a New York Times column on happiness. And you know, he dives into how people even respond to that word. When you ask someone to report their levels of happiness, they are responding to you with a read of their feelings. And Arthur Brooks, you know, who is a researcher with deep knowledge on this issue, wants to remind that happiness is best not thought of as a feeling. It is a journey. It is a place that you are trying to get to every day, but it's not necessarily a real destination. We tend to think of happiness as an immediate feeling, but it's more of an indicator that there are good things going on in our lives. He once described it as happiness is when you smell good food cooking in the kitchen, but it is the evidence that something is in the kitchen that is good in your life. And so kind of to build that out, and he breaks it down into 3 pillars. You have to have enjoyment in your life. That is things like maybe eating with people, right? Having meals with people you care about. Satisfaction. And satisfaction often comes from the struggle. And then the other thing is meaning. So understanding your purpose and your place in the world. And his research has showed that if you're missing one of those 3 things, you take an immediate 30% hit on your reported levels of happiness. You have to have your foot in all 3 of those pillars to report yourself as being relatively happy. And Americans struggle with meaning, satisfaction, and enjoyment.
I think that firstly, that's really interesting in and of itself. And I also think it links back to where we began when we were introducing this segment about the idea of disconnection and an increasingly solitary society or disconnected society. And I think, you know, there are 50 or 100 or 1,000 reasons that we could give for that. And people of a more conservative disposition, I think, would often talk about the loosening of community bonds of churches, for example, declining church membership. I think people of a more liberal disposition might think of things like the fact that in a previous generation it was comparatively easier for families on one income to survive and thrive, and now often you have, even if you have a 2-parent family, you have parents who are obligated to work very, very long hours. That in itself causes a sort of fraying of those familial situations, and obviously in 1-parent families that becomes even more severe. So it's a fascinating topic.
And I might try to tie 2 things together here, because you mentioned sort of how conservatives tend to think of this issue. And even when I was looking over this index, my first gut instinct was, what are the fertility rates in these countries? How often are they having children? How many? There's no South Korea on these rankings at all, and we all know about the population problems they're having. But there is a connection between family formation and children and reported degrees of happiness. But that is tied in many ways to sacrifice of the things that American culture tells you are going to make you most happy, which is achievement, making more money, free time, going on things like vacations. And I'm going to tie this to something else, which is a very famous book by Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, psychologist, and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And the entire thing is this wonderful essay on how people find meaning in their lives despite suffering, hard conditions. And at the end of the book, a student asks him, what is the meaning to life? And his answer for that is the meaning of my life, I believe, is to help other people find the meaning of theirs. And so we have a problem in our country with too much self-focus. Liberals might say selfishness. So concern with everything that's going on with you, and having children is an element of that. You start caring a lot less about your wants, your needs, your dreams when you're focused on building the wants and needs of somebody else. And that is, I think, the underlying problem here that we might be seeing. There's a lot of social cohesion in those Nordic countries and places like Iceland, and hard conditions, but they sort of believe that they're doing it together and that it is something that you do without complaining.
Yeah, and I think that kind of collective mindset has real benefits, as you say, in terms of social cohesion and in terms of making it a little easier for people to find some meaning in life.
Yeah, even as a libertarian, I have qualms with radical individualism. We need each other. We need community. It's good to know your neighbors. And it's fine if you want to go have a house out in the country and build a life there, but you're going to be judged over time based on, not judged, but you're going to derive a sense of connection to the world around you based on how many people you know and who shows up at your Thanksgiving dinner and eventually your funeral. And right now, I think a lot of people are missing that.
Well, today's Rising has brought you the meaning of life. I hope that was helpful for our audience, but that does it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while you're on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Stephen, thanks for joining. We hope we'll see you again soon.
I'm sure we will.
And I shall be back at this table with Amber Duke tomorrow, so come join us then.